Hello, welcome to BBC News. This is Your Voice, Your BBC News, where we'll be answering some of your questions about pets and vets, specifically the cost of getting your pets cared for at vets. There has been a new report out today by a watchdog here in the UK talking about basically a need for greater transparency when it comes to pricing. We're going to get into the details with some of your questions. We've got three experts on the hand to take us through. First of all, we have our investigations reporter with us, Jim Connolly, who's been covering this story and will bring us right up to speed in a moment. We have Dr. Paul Manctolo, Chief Vet of national pet charity Blue Cross. And we also have Lisa Webb, consumer law expert at Consumer Group Which. Hello to all three. Great to see you. We will get into the questions in just a moment. First of all, though, we just want to get up to speed with what some of the new proposals and ideas are. Jim, just talk us through what we've heard.
Well, this has all come about because we've seen such an increase in vet prices in recent years. The average vet prices across the market rose by 63% in the 8 years to 2023. A lot of critics have put that down to a big shift in the market, a shift in who owns vet practices, and that's what the CMA has been looking at. Prior to the 90s, at the end of the 90s, the vet practices were generally owned by vets. The law changed, and that meant that non-vets could open up vet practices and run vet practices. And at that point, a lot of private companies came in and bought out chains of vets and bought out vet practices and completely changed the landscape. And now 60% or over 60% of vets are owned by one of six big companies. And the CMA has been investigating that, looking at whether that's had a disproportionate effect on prices. Has it driven up the prices? It points to the fact that the average treatment at one of these six chains is 16.6% higher than at an independent vet practice. And it's looked at measures that it thinks maybe can help bring those prices down, and it's looked at the wider market, and one of its big themes really is a lack of transparency, and it talks about that across the board. A lack of transparency when it comes to who owns a vet practice, for example, a lack of transparency when it comes to how much it's going to cost when you go in through the door and get some basic treatment, and even more so when it comes to you're getting big treatment, how much is it going to cost as you move down the line with that treatment for your animal. And that's really at the heart of this today, is a lot of talk about transparency, a lack of it, and what can be done to change it. And they've suggested 21 possible remedies. Some of those include things like more transparency, forcing vets to be more transparent when it comes to the price lists, putting their price lists online, forcing them to be more open about who owns them, and fixed prices when it comes to prescriptions, allowing people to go online and buy drugs for their pets cheaper by getting a prescription for £16, for example, and then being able to go online and find cheaper prescriptions than maybe available at your local vet practice. That's just a few of the 21 measures. We'll have to wait until next year now to find out which of those 21 measures are going to be brought in. In the meantime, we're going to have a lot of lobbying from these vet companies, independent vets, all putting their case forward to say why they don't think some of these measures will work. And there is a lot of criticism out there of some of these measures, with the BVA saying that, yeah, they back this, the British Veterinary Association. They think more transparency is a good thing, better regulation would be a good thing. But when it comes to some of the individual measures, they are worried that those measures may make things actually more confusing, because it is a really complicated landscape to quote and give prices for. So it's a really complicated mixed story that we've got today, and there's plenty to unpick.
Jim, thank you very much for that. So that's the broad overview for you. We'll get into some of those specific measures. We'll be back with Jim in a moment, but I want to get straight now to some of the questions that you've been sending us. First of all, Joanne in Luton, fairly straightforward one. Is there going to be a price cap for operations at the vets? Let's bring in Lisa for the first time. Lisa, great to see you. Just talk to us about this idea. I'm sure many pet owners would like a kind of cap because some of the prices are extraordinary.
Authority is suggesting a cap, but that cap is only in relation to the writing of prescriptions. So they're suggesting about £16 in order to get your vet to give you a prescription for medication that you can then go and buy online elsewhere for cheaper. What they are not suggesting, though, is capping the cost of specific treatments. Now, there'll be lots of reasons for that, but specifically, we're going to be looking at the fact that treatment will vary on a case by case basis. So you might have a very large dog that needs a greater amount of sedative than a very small dog. So you can't say in that scenario that you can cap the cost. But they will be making it easier, we hope, for people to be able to compare prices. So where a vet reasonably believes that the cost of a treatment will cost over £500, they need to be able to provide you with a detailed breakdown of the cost so that you can see if there are any other practices that can offer it for a better price. So hopefully people will be in with the opportunity to actually shop around.
OK, thank you for that, Lisa. I just want to read kind of a question and a story now from Graham in Macclesfield. It is upsetting and sadly, I'm sure, not too unfamiliar to many pet owners. But Graham says, we had to euthanise our elderly terrier. It was a Sunday. We found an open practice. The cost was £650. And we were told that was apparently due in part because it was a Sunday. So effectively, if they waited for a weekday, that means it would be potentially cheaper. But he says here that hardly seems in the animal's best interests. Why do some vets charge more during the weekend? Paul, let's bring you in here.
Hi there. Yeah, I completely understand how upsetting that must have felt. And I absolutely don't believe that people should delay care just because of cost. It's not in the animal's interest and it's not great from a welfare perspective. But in terms of the cost of out-of-hours treatment, I mean, when I first graduated about 20 years ago, we used to, as vets, cover all our own out-of-hours. But that often meant that we were working 24-hour shifts. You'd work all day and then you'd do a night shift on call as well. And that was better from the pet owner's perspective because it was the same vets. You could run those services at a much lower cost. But obviously from a vet welfare perspective, it's not great at all. And not many vets want to do out of hours now. On top of that, it was deemed illegal by the European Time Directive to work in those sort of ways. So many vet practices now outsource to specialist emergency services, and those emergency services are very, very expensive to run. They have to have dedicated night vets and night staff, and they have to have all the diagnostic tools and things to support emergency procedures. And back in the practice I used to work at, we had to bring in a dedicated night vet team, and all of a sudden the care became much more expensive, which people couldn't necessarily understand, and from their perspective was a much worse service. But it faces the reality of what the costs of these emergency services are to run.
OK, Paul, thank you for that background and detail. I want to go to Lisa again now. It's a broad question. It kind of encapsulates lots of what we're talking about. Stella has got in touch with us asking simply, why do different vets charge such varied prices?
Yeah, and actually Jim touched on this earlier when he explained that the CMA findings have pointed out that those large vet groups on average charge almost 17% more than independent practices. Now, the CMA has argued here that because of the lack of competition within the arena, because there are just those 6 big players, prices are higher than they need to be. And they've calculated that there's a consumer harm there over 5 years of around £1 billion. Now, there are lots of reasons vets might charge different prices. You might, for example, have different staff with different qualification levels. And as Paul just pointed out, you might have situations where there are out of hours available or not. So there could be really valid reasons for prices being different. But something that's a big problem that we're seeing is these large veterinary groups charging more than independent practices. And because they take up such a large proportion of the market, we're seeing those prices skyrocket.
OK, want to go to the issue of prescriptions, because we have mentioned it a little, but it seems pertinent here. So this is Julie in Exeter, really stark example. So a few years ago, my Labrador was prescribed antibiotics for an ear infection, which cost £460. I found the same antibiotics from an online supplier for £60. So a £400 difference. The vet didn't tell me I could get a prescription online. Why is this allowed to happen? Paul?
Yeah, and there is a really stark difference there in the cost, and it's really concerning that the vet there didn't explain that these medicines could be obtained cheaper online. But I think it's probably just worth understanding a little bit as well about the fact that veterinary practices are bound by law to buy their treatments, their medicines from a veterinary wholesaler, and often veterinary practices can't buy those drugs in at the same price even that online pharmacists can sell them at. So there is a real big disparity there. And also, I would say that a lot of vet practices historically haven't necessarily charged for their time properly and have made markups and margins on medicines to try and meet the running costs of that practice. But I think the CMA are addressing this in some of their proposals, in that there's now a price cap on writing prescriptions, and that vets should really be explaining to owners that they can achieve those and obtain those medicines from online pharmacies.
Lisa, just want to get your thoughts on that as well. Is this something like that example? Are you expecting that to not be able to happen?
Yeah, and in fact, this is something I've been through myself as a pet owner. I used to have a Weimaraner dog who had a heart condition. Her tablets were very, very expensive to keep her going in her later years, and my vet wanted to charge me 3 times the price that I could get those tablets for online. Now, I was very lucky. My vet told me where I could find it cheaper online. So that's great. And it actually saved me around £500 a year by doing it that way. But by the CMA saying, actually, we need vets to tell people this every time, like my vet did, then that means that consumers will have those choices available to them. You, of course, end up paying for convenience if you end up getting your drugs from the same place as you get your prescription. But I do think it's worth people at least knowing that there are options out there for them.
Thank you for that. I want to bring in Jim again, our investigations reporter. Jim, you did mention it right at the beginning, but just flesh out what happens next and what happens now, because we've got plenty of questions from pet owners here. Give us an example of what are the potentially other measures that may or may not make it and what the timescale is here.
Yeah, well, there's 21 potential remedies, so I've got them here looking through the report. Some of them we've talked about: requiring people to publish comprehensive price lists, being clear that they're part of a large group, allowing people to have this information. So much of this comes back to this issue of transparency. It seems to be something that if I speak to vets, and I've spoken to a few vets today to kind of gauge their reaction to the CMA report, they're quite welcoming of this, especially the independent vets, because they're fearful that they get a lot of criticism, a lot of people being very angry at them. But they're saying, look, we are trying to be transparent. We're trying to put that information out there for people, and it's maybe bigger practices and bigger chains that aren't quite as open with that information that causes them some problems, because they all feel like they all get tarred with the same brush. So many of the vets that I've spoken to today are actually quite welcoming of this idea of being more transparent. The British Veterinary Association themselves have come forward and said, we welcome a big push towards transparency. And I think one of the really striking things that I've noticed speaking to vets up and down the country as part of my investigation over the last year and a half, 2 years, is how many vets just say to us, one of the big issues is, quite simply, vets don't like talking about money. They get into being a vet because they want to help animals. And I think if you speak to someone like Paul, he will say that many of his colleagues don't like talking about how much stuff costs because they feel a bit embarrassed and they just want to get on with the job.
Well, that's interesting, Jim. Let's just put that straight to Paul now, because, Paul, you were nodding there at parts of what Jim was saying. Do you agree with that point about money? And just briefly, are you supportive of the direction here?
Yeah, and absolutely concur with Jim there on that point, is that as vets we train to treat animals and to promote animal health and welfare. We don't have hardly any financial training in our degrees when we train, and we find conversations often about costs very awkward. And remember, the vet that you see in the consult room doesn't necessarily set the costs of that practice either. That's set by the business owners. And I think it's probably worth pointing out that at the start of the CMA investigation, 11,000 veterinary professionals actually responded to that. And there was a real drive in the profession to really sort of solve this problem.
Right.
And I broadly, most people I speak to in the profession agree and support these recommendations, and if it gives more pricing transparency and consumer choice, then absolutely it's something that we would all welcome. OK, Paul, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, and thanks to Lisa as well, and of course Jim. This is BBC News. I am Lewis Vaughan-Jones. Thanks very much for your company. Bye-bye.